On the orange, we have Eritrea, Sierra Leone, and South Sudan. Meanwhile, other nations under the yellow category will be Angola, Benin, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Cape Verde, Chad, the Republic of Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Equatorial Guinea, the Gambia, Liberia, Malawi, Mali, Mauritania, Sao Tome, and Principe, as well as Zimbabwe. Beyond travel restrictions, this policy could have far-reaching consequences for trade, diplomacy, and Africa's, or better still, America's standing on the continent. Will it strain relations further, or is this just a political posturing? Today we dissect the implications of this stop, of these latest developments, with our experts from around the world, and we ask ourselves the question: what does this mean for Africa, for the United States, and for the future of global engagement? Ladies and gentlemen, this is Talking Point. Stay with us. Hello Africa and the world, thank you immensely for joining us on the fresh dose of Talking Point over your Pan-African channel for you Media Africa. You had it right in our preamble. The United States President Donald Trump has unveiled via a document released by the New York Times plans to impose travel bans on 22 African countries out of a total of 43 countries globally. And of course, these countries are regarded as either red, orange or yellow zones on the African continent or elsewhere. And of course, to evoke these implications it will have on U.S.-Africa relations, I'm being joined this day by Dr. Stanley FONGOD, who is joining us in his capacity as a Pan-Africanist and economist and the CEO of FINTECH. Good day, sir.
Hello, thank you so much for having me, Sharon. I hope that we have a fruitful conversation, and thank those who are joining and my co-partners who are joining in as well.
Exactly, and of course, just to mention that we shall be discussing, the latest development in the course of this program. We just got indications that SHITTU has just joined us in his capacity as a digital news editor, joined us all the way from West Africa, precisely in Nigeria. Good day to you, Mr. SHITTU. SHITTU, are you with us? And if you can hear us, please, we are beckoning you to unmute your mic, and you're welcome on board. Now, to debut today's conversation with you, Dr. FONGOD. Now, in your perspective, you're in the United States, and of course, you might understand, given you're equally an African, but then, what might be the official reasons? A few weeks back we spoke about the immigration policy, where we expected to see some sort of mass deportation of immigrants that are residing in the United States illegally, be it on the African continent or elsewhere. Now, the New York Times has unveiled that the Trump administration is expected to impose travel bans on some African countries, about 22. Now, what might be the official reasons behind this latest development on the proposed Trump's travel bans on these African nations?
I think that there's really not much to to talk about, especially when it comes to the Trump administration and its proposed ban on citizens of these nations coming into the United States. I think that one of the things which we have failed to understand is the previous administration of Donald Trump in 2016, which started in 2016, basically brought about a sweeping ban which was aimed at national security for the United States. And so they have to look at these countries and see where terrorist organizations or terrorists are operating, and then they basically have this vetting. It's actually not even a ban, it's just a very restrictive move where they are aimed at doing extensive vetting to make sure that whoever is entering into the United States is doing so not on the basis of the fact that they are terrorists or affiliated with any terrorist organization. As a Pan-African, I have no problem with it, and the reason for that is because obviously I begin to think that maybe if we will be restricted from basically allowing our elites, those who basically run our countries and eat our money, money to not travel to those countries where they basically will go out to seek medical help. Maybe that will basically means that we start investing a little bit more at home, and that might be good for the general populace. And I think that that's exactly what we need so far as the continent is concerned. I'm not in support of that very restrictive measure so far as the posture America is taking. But the reality is that America has every right to protect herself. America has every right to be able to protect her citizens. Donald Trump was elected not as the president of the world. Donald Trump was elected president of the United States of America. And the reality is this, that if you are on the African continent and you're pissed off at Donald Trump, you should be pissed off at the person who is running your country. You should be pissed off at the person who is at the helm of your nation, because what has made America great is basically what the leadership in the United States of America has done. Even if they had to loot everything we have on the African continent, it was that leadership that inspired people to do so. What have we done on the continent of Africa? Absolutely nothing. And so to sit on the sidelines of history and basically talk about how pissed off we are in relationship to what is happening on the continent of Africa, I think that that's a little bit demented. The reality is that we are throwing stones at the wrong target. That's not the goalpost. That is not the milestone that we have set. The milestone is for us to hold our leaders accountable and to be able to make sure that whatever it takes, we bring people like that, hold them to account and make sure that we have the kind of leadership on the continent that is meaningful, the leadership that brings about progress to the people, not sitting on the sidelines and waiting for foreign aid. No one cares. Are we going to be affected especially when it comes to foreign direct investments, and when it comes to trade, and when it also comes to issues like the tourism sector? Yes, of course. You have countries like South Africa, Egypt, and countries like Kenya, Tanzania with safari and stuff that might suffer. But the reality is this: we have to basically start thinking a little bit more about what we do, how we do it, and what we enhance the continent of Africa rather than depending on foreign aid. And so far as I'm concerned, the greatest investment or the greatest amount of money coming into the African continent is from people who are in the diaspora, that is from remittance of families living overseas that basically put money into the continent. Recently we're talking about what is happening in Nigeria, especially when it comes to remittance. And the reality is that if you look at how much money is actually coming in just from Nigerians outside of Nigeria into Nigeria alone, that money is staggering, more than 24 billion US dollars. We're talking about some serious amount of money that is coming through War Remit and War Remit, MoneyGram, Western Union, all those avenues that people use in sending money overseas back home. That is remarkable. But then if we can be able to find ways, that's good. I mean, that's great, because that's a lot of money coming back home. But the reality is that at the same time, that money is coming home to a system that is not structured for any kind of growth. And so the money comes primarily to those who are just doing nothing else but consuming. So we don't have the system, neither is the ecosystem viable enough for people to basically involved in any kind of industry. So we are not manufacturing nothing, we are not trying to grow anything, we are barely feeding ourselves. And so the reality is this: we can complain all we want so far as what Donald Trump is doing or proposed ban. We need a mirror rather than Washington, D.C.
Indeed, and of course, if Africa needs to bring about change, it's all about, political will, which we've reiterated in the course of numerous editions on this program. Now, given that Shittu is with us, Shittu, you listened to your co-panelist, and he shared the opinion that these travel restrictions on African countries and other countries elsewhere, it brings to the mind of African leaders, the consciousness for them to be able to invest back on the African continent, and of course, address some of the pressing issues that are plaguing the continent. And of course, he mentioned that it's in line with the U.S. policy of national security. From your perspective, looking at the list of 22 nations on the African continent, Nigeria doesn't happen to, fall on this Trump's blacklist. But then, do you believe that this move primarily is not just about just alone national security, but could be linked to the immigration control or better still a political strategy? FOWORA, are you with us? Please, can you kindly unmute your mic? Well, SHITTU, hopefully you can hear me. Please unmute your mic from your end so we can be able to hear what you're stating. Yeah, please proceed.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Please proceed. So I was asking that away from being this move linked to national security, could we equally tie it to, you know, the immigration control within the United States and look at that as a political strategy?
Yeah, it's all in one. You know, one problem. If you solve one problem, you will solve other problems. Already, there are issues of immigration that the United States seeks to solve. There are issues of national security that it seeks to solve. It considers this action, this move, as a necessary requirement to ensure that those that are coming into their country are checked properly. You know, there's a sureness that they do not fall as security risks to the country. However, what is a little delightful for me is that most of the countries fall under, you know, the yellow ban, where they have between now and 60 days to regularize their relationship with the United States, so that the ban can be taken off from them. Having said that, this ban has far-reaching trade implication, human capital implication. It has implication of foreign investment. It has implication of remittances that come back to Africa, and a lot of economic implications. So, yes, he's trying to protect America, considering some of the policies that he has executed in the past few weeks or few months. However, some of those policies are already impacting on the American economy. Just 2 days ago, I saw an economic release that suggests that the American economy is, you know, is on the downside. And so there's need to balance between some of these policies of position of ban, you know, tariffs and all of that. You know, there's need to balance some of these things. Yes, the intention may be for the growth of America, but the world today is so interdependent that sometimes when you try to implement such policies, you end up in self-harm.
Thank you so much, SHITTU. Back to you, Dr. FONGOD, now to react to what SHITTU just said. He said that these restrictions have had some sort of economic impact on the American economy. We recall equally that in recent times, the U.S. has been imposing sanctions, straight tariffs on other countries within the European space. So away from that, how do you react to this, you know, these implications that come along with the recent decisions that have been made by the Trump administration?
Well, the reality is that, I mean, is that if it's coming from an economic standpoint, and I think that, you know, I've mentioned it, that the continent will, especially these countries, if they do not comply, will be able to face some significant problems. And the reason for that is because I mean, apart from a country like Nigeria, which is surprisingly not on the list, and I think I have a lot of speculations for that. Yeah, I think it has a lot to do with trade, and also it has to do with the fact that maybe that the Trump administration basically understands that when it came to the issues of Boko Haram and the terrorist organization, or, you know, that terrorist organization operating in Nigeria, that was really not even a construct from where all of them comes from. It was just something that was actually promoted by, you know, the two previous administrations, or a previous administration before him. That would be in 2016 in the first term, which would be underneath the Barack Hussein Obama administration. That being said, I'm thinking that on the economic front, we might have a little bit of issues. And the reason for that is because primarily, if you look at the amount of remittance, which is basically, what really sustained the continent, it is migrant workers who leave the continent of Africa, go to Europe, come into the Americas, and America is the most prosperous nation in the world. And as a result of that, people make good money in this part of the world, and they're able to send good money back home. That is the story across the continent, especially when you have migrant workers in the United States of America. That would be a major hit. I think that we'll have issues again in areas of tourism. Once we begin to restrict people and have travel bans, then people from the United States who are basically who basically do have the money to spend so far as tourism is concerned, especially in a place that has become the maker, for most African Americans, which is basically a place like Egypt, all right, and for everybody else will be the safaris of Tanzania and Kenya. They too will suffer. Those areas will suffer tremendously. So there has to be a way in which there's some kind of concessions made, especially with these countries. And I don't think that those concessions will be a little bit hard, the hard things to be able to do, just so that we can be able to keep things open and allow for the movement of goods and services across these nations. And secondly, I also believe that this posture being taken by Donald Trump has a lot to do with the posture that Africa has taken in relationship to the Eastern Bloc. I think that Donald Trump is basically pushing this just so that he can be able to, have this magic wand, which will be able to tell the continent of Africa, well, listen, if you're going to look at the East, we can make things a little bit quite difficult for you, as opposed to you looking at the West. My point has always been, so far as the continent of Africa is concerned, we are neither looking to the West, neither are we looking to the East. We are looking to Africa. And I think that except we basically focus who we are on the continent, irrespective of whatever comes, the East will not save us, the West will not save us, and what eventually will happen is that we become a wasteland for everybody else. Almost every commodity that is mined on the African continent, every other continent has it. There is nothing so unique. We just have a cluster abundance of it that is quite great. It is huge on the continent of Africa, true, but Russia has it. The largest gold deposit in the world is actually not on the African continent, right? So, but why is the world coming onto Africa? Because probably speaking, we don't even know what to do about it. After we have been drained, then they will now start taking care of their own commodities in their own nations, and we will have nothing left. And I think that time has come for this continent to basically rise up. It is so shameful that we can sit and be talking about whether Trump is basically restricting people from entering into the United States or not, and yet there are pretty much no borders on the continent of Africa. You can show up anywhere in the eastern regions of Cameroon, for example, and also in Ghana, and you will have Chinese men basically ravaging the whole entire countryside in search of gold. They're digging everything they can dig at the expense of the environment, and nobody is saying anything about it. You can make the same, statements also about a place like Goma, and you can also make the same statements about a place like Central African Republic. Nobody is protecting anything, and we are the only fools in the world so far as protecting our natural resources are concerned.
Ladies, we're coming back to you, Dr. FONGOD, for us to be able to, pick up from where you stopped. Now, Shittu, let's dissect the countries that have been banned, category by category, from the red to the orange and to the yellow. Now, we look at countries like Somalia, Libya, and Sudan. Those nations were banned completely, according to the list. Now, you move to the orange section, where we have Eritrea, Sierra Leone, and South Sudan. Those countries, in one way or the other, have had issues. But when we go to other countries beyond, let's take a nation like Uganda. Under the Biden administration, Uganda had issues like diplomatic issues with the United States as a result of the law, the LGBTQ law that the nation enacted in its country. Now, away from that, we can equally cite a nation like the Democratic Republic of Congo that is still reeling from turmoil at this point in time, as well as Zimbabwe, that might have some economic crisis. But when you look at these nations, Zimbabwe has an embargo that is weighing on the country. When you look at the DRC with the ongoing crisis, could it be that Zimbabwe could, or the Democratic Republic of Congo per se, could have been on this list because of the Lobito port, which is expected to link Angola, you know, and Zambia. But then with this link, because, and remember that countries on the yellow list are expected to address the concerns within their countries within a duration of 60 days. Now, from your perspective, what criteria were being used to be able to put these African countries on this blacklist?
Some of the countries that have been identified, most of the time the concerns are based on the quality of leadership, the quality of democracy in those countries. Some of these countries that have been mentioned so far have over time suspended, you know, the law and done things in ways that are not befitting across the Committee of Nations. Therefore, sometimes these bans are meant to reflect, to help these countries to reflect on what they have done correctly and what they have not done correctly. I mean, you don't have to travel to the United States anyway, but if there's a ban, it means that this country has a problem with you as a country. So in terms of what needs to be done, these are diplomatic issues that we discussed one-on-one between the ministries of foreign affairs and that of the United States and that of the African nations. I have not seen situations where African nations are putting it to the sponsors of violence in Africa to say, you know what, because you have been fingered in or complicit in funding crisis on the continent, we are banning, you know, your diplomats, we are banning, you know, your foreign affairs persons from coming to our country. Most of the time, it is we Africans that are the receiving end, and it is not fair. So, yes, the ban is on. Yes, there's a window for regularization and for correcting the anomaly. But we have to introspect, look inwards, and be sure that some of these concerns that are being raised are solved once and for all. Uganda, beyond Uganda's stance on the LGBTQ.
But Uganda, sorry to cut you short, Shittu, Uganda happens not to be on this list. I guess it's because of the stance of Donald Trump. You remember during his inauguration, he stated that he considers just two sexes, male and female. So I feel Uganda's not on this blacklist because of the stance at which the country takes, actually.
Okay, that's fine. So Uganda may not be on the list, but remember that there is a repressive political atmosphere in Uganda.
True.
Where most of the political opponents of Yoweri Museveni are being locked up, are being railroaded, are being attacked.
True.
You know, some of them have been found have gone missing for a while. Ordinarily, because of such behavior, such country would be, you know, seen as a pariah state amongst other nations. In any case, Eritrea has shown stubbornly also over time to not have conducted proper elections. So you have Alwaki as president for decades without proper elections that will engender democracy, that would embolden the citizens, that would make people see, you know, governance from a more holistic perspective. It's the same with Cameroon, where a lot of people who are 40 years and, you know, between 35 and 40 do not know any other president apart from Paul Biya. And democratic space would want you to have people participatory democracy, where people can contest and participate and, you know, emerge as leaders genuinely voted by people in power. So there are concerns that can be solved, you know, like I said, within the 60 days window, and there are concerns that may not be solvable. Countries that have consistently violated international rules, you know, engaged in war situation, continue to commit crime against humanity, and have not held their leaders accountable. Some of these countries may, you know, suffer a deeper aspect of these restrictions. So we hope that through conversation, communication with, you know, the United States and ministries of foreign affairs of these countries, there will be some meeting point. It's also a call for us to reflect on the things we do to ourselves as nations.
Exactly, and of course, like you mentioned, Shittu, it's a time for reflection for the African continent. And back to you, Dr. FONGOD, picking up from where your co-panelist stopped. Do you share the same opinion as him as far as nations like Uganda is concerned? And why do you think Uganda was not included on this proposed list?
Well, I think that if there was any nation on the African continent who basically stood up and, told the Biden administration to go do things to themselves, it would have been Uganda. And I think that Uganda was unflinched, they didn't move 1 inch. They were absolutely resolute when it came to the idea of the LGBT community. And to think for a second, anyway, that the Biden administration thought for a minute that they could impose any of those sanctions on the African continent was a little bit demented. I don't know exactly who was pushing that policy within the White House or the Biden White House. Whoever did that stuff was a madman. And the reason for that is because if you were going to consider trying to be able to get the world into this LGBTQXY, God knows what, why don't you try that stuff in a place like Syria? Why don't you try that in a place like Saudi Arabia? Why don't you take it to Iran? Why don't you talk about the boys in Tunisia? I mean, come to the African continent, go to Morocco, just go to any of these Arab nations and then start one of those nonsense. And you don't have to even blame the Biden, administration. You just basically have to look at the African continent and the posture that most African leaders have taken, especially when they are communicating with the United States. It is always a seven-master relationship. All right. So the African presidents are sevens, and the United States of America, whoever is leading, is master. And that is the most sickening thing, to any Pan-African. There has to be a way in which we have a little bit of fortitude. There has to be a way in which we can stand and basically demand something and speak for something and stand absolutely for something. And you might say whatever we want to say, for the endless regime of the president of Uganda, which it is what it is. And so there are many locations and many presidents like that on the African continent. But the reality is this: at some particular point in time, we have to consider our cultures, our values, our traditions, and our norms to be a little bit more important than the talk of democracy. And the reason for that is because if there be democracy that is in antithesis to our cultures, our values, our norms, then that in itself is not democracy at all. So we have to be able to define something. What are we defining? We're defining who we are. We'll define what we stand for, and we will have to let the world understand exactly the premise for our own existence, and that there is nothing that can come out of the West to come and instill this level of madness on the continent of Africa in the name of freedom. Freedom that does not have restriction is not freedom, that's chaos. And so for us on the continent of Africa, we like order, and that's why when we start having chaotic stuff like the LGBT stuff shows up on the continent of Africa, and it's being pushed for God knows what. And this madness began with Barack Hussein Obama, the fake African. And I don't know exactly why on God's green earth he shows up in a place like Kenya. You would think he's coming back home, and the only thing that came out of his mouth was the fact that you have to be with this LGBT stuff, and the president of Kenya back then was like, we have bigger issues in this nation than this LGBT madness. We have real legitimate issues, and you will think that someone in his position would be able to look at the continent of Africa, look at Kenya for that matter, and say maybe railroads, maybe infrastructure, maybe something else. No. He came into the continent with one agenda in mind, and that's quite sickening. So what does that tell you? That tells you that as closest as the continent of Africa has been, to have a son of the soil, a son from the continent, all right, a son of an African becoming president of the United States of America, and the only thing he could propose for the continent of Africa was LGBTQ garbage. Well, that tells you a little bit about us. We
Dr.
need to protect who we are.
Dr. FONGOD, I'm sorry to cut you short, but then look at other countries, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger on this blacklist. Away from that, we have a nation like Cameroon. Now, dissecting your Cameroonian, dissecting, having been on the yellow list, which it's a list that gives the opportunity, if it's enacted, they give them a duration of 60 days to be able to address their issues. When you look at like a nation like Cameroon, speaking of Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger, these nations have just underwent coups and actually under a mode, I would like to say, reconstruction mode. The people, populace of these countries are not complaining as of now because they already have a lot of issues to deal with. There is still ECOWAS that is still striving to get these three nations back within the regional bloc. At this point, what does the United States really gain, you know, in imposing such restrictions on nations like this?
Are you talking about the boys in the Sahel?
I'm talking about the alliance of Sahel states.
Well, so far as the alliance of Sahel state is concerned, I could care less what Donald Trump tries to do in Africa in relationship to the boys in the Sahel. I've consistently maintained that the boys in the Sahel are within their rights to be able to maintain the kind of sovereignty that they want for their region. Throughout the whole, for more than a decade, that particular region has been ravaged, you know, as a result of a botched, Arab Spring that basically led to the death of Mohammed Gaddafi underneath the so-called Barack Hussein Obama and Hillary Clinton. That is what led to the madness for which, you know, weapons of war basically tunnel south of the Sahara, into south of the Sahara, south, you know, moving south through the Sahara into places like, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. You have ISIS operating in those areas because of Libya. You have Al-Qaeda of the Greater Maghreb operating in that area because of Libya. And the reason why Libya failed is as a result of Barack Hussein Obama. There are young Africans that are actually, as we speak, you know, being farmed in Libya, young women who are being kidnapped and farmed in Libya and let them have children, and they'll take these children from them, you know, after being raped, you know, they get pregnant, get these kids, and then sell them in the black market. That is what is happening in Libya. Human beings, black Africans, are being sold in Libya as cattle. That in itself is crazy. But yet, you know, I'm still waiting for the posture of the West so far as that, you know, that's concerned. My point is, whatever those boys are doing in the Sahel, it's within their rights. And frankly speaking, I think that they should not be in any hurry to reintegrate into the Western, bloc, to the Western part of the Western region, which is basically ECOWAS. I think that if they really want to integrate into ECOWAS, there has to be major concessions that are made in relationship to their sovereignty and what is it that they stand for. Well, Niger, before the fall of Bazoum, was the worst in terms of all human, development index. Today, they are doing a whole lot better. As of 2024, they were the fastest growing economy on the continent of Africa, and as of 2024, they were the 7th fastest growing economy in the world. I don't know of any other nation that has had that level of transition, you know, and that level of growth in a year, in just a year's less than 12 months. So we need to be able to celebrate whatever is happening in that area. And so far as I'm concerned, there are many things to be talked about in relationship to Trump's issues and, you know, with the continent of Africa. But I think that when it comes to the Sahel, it was none of their making. The Sahel fell as a result of the United States and the worst possible president that America has ever had, Barack Hussein Obama.
Thank you immensely, Dr. FONGOD. Back to you, SHITTU FOWORA. Now, we earlier on mentioned that, you know, this decision or the travel restrictions could have some implications on, you know, U.S.-Africa relations. But away from that, do you believe that this policy, if it finally gets into full force, could push more African countries, you know, diverting to other superpowers like we're seeing on the African continent at this point in time, like towards China, Russia, and amidst other nations?
Yeah, I mean, most times Africans are, deathless in the sense that it is almost difficult to stop an African mind from doing what he or she seeks to do. If
True.
it is a search for better living, better lifestyle, or better economic opportunities, there are lots of countries in the world where Africans can, veer into. There's a chance. It doesn't have to be strictly going towards China and Russia. There's a chance they may explore other countries around the United States. They may explore the United Kingdom, for example. They may explore Canada. Whichever one works best for them. What will happen in any case is that the brain drain that we have always complained about may actually get some downtime. I mean, there may be less brain drain when we have less people being able to go to the United States for greener pastures. So it's a win-win. I mean, sometimes we see some of these restrictions as something negative for us on the continent. But in the long run, if we reflect on the implications and we fashion out a method around it, then it will be a win for both the United States and African nations.
Okay, I was staying with you, Shittu. You mentioned, of course, that Africa has the right, you know, to partner with any power in terms to, as like, of course, the law of partnership stipulates that no country can be isolated in a multipolar world. But then, looking at all these changes that are happening at the global level, what impact could this have on U.S. businesses and investors that are already existing or operating in these African countries?
So when it comes to investors, there's a lot that can happen. I mean, when you start to implement trade protectionism policies, it sometimes affects, you know, it may impact immigration reforms, and then border security. But one of the things that it will affect in terms of business is how much, you know, trade happens between both countries, because traveling should ordinarily not be a problem. But when the traveling is predicated upon certain social construct or the condition of the country, for example, a Cameroonian cannot be blamed for the activities of the government in Cameroon. So I would ordinarily say that some of these restrictions should be mindful of, you know, the businesses, the cross-cultural exchanges, you know, that may happen. Because there are people, for example, who have their parents living in in Africa, while they live in the United States, and they will need to move between these countries just to see their families. Now, when you make unnecessary restrictions, it means that when they try to return back to their base, where they are positively impacting the American economy, they may not be able to do so because of such restrictions. And then it begins to affect, you know, it begins to cause job losses. It begins to diminish relationship between both countries, because there are existing, will I say, trade MOUs between these countries. When you begin to restrict movement, or you begin to impose certain visa restrictions, it may affect what had been anticipated, you know, a few years ago. So the emphasis for America is national sovereignty, and you cannot blame America for that posture. What it should always tell us is that we need to buckle up as Africans.
Thank you so much. Now, going by the document, it states that, you know, students, tourists, you know, and other professionals could be restricted. But then how would this affect, you know, the relations that have already been, you know, established over the years? And to get a broader perspective, how can Africa be able to position itself at some point where it doesn't tremble by decisions like this, you know, in the wake of this new awakening we're seeing across the African continent? Day after day, we're seeing the ideology of Pan-Africanism that's growing across the African continent. Dr. FONGOD, how can Africa reposition itself or redefine its stance?
I think that the most important thing we need to focus on is this whole entire idea of self-reliance. And without self-reliance, I don't think that there's a whole lot more that we can be able to achieve so far as the continent is concerned. And the reason for that is because we cannot focus primarily on what is happening in the West, neither should we focus primarily on what is happening in the East. We have to be able to find ways in which we harness what we have. What we have is our potential, it's our capacities, it's our land land. It's our minerals. That's what we have. We have the human capital. What we need to do is develop it. We need to create an ecosystem on the continent of Africa that gives us the best possible advantage to be able to become the best thing that we can be within the capacities that we carry. And the reality is that the capacity is great. The continent is sitting, at a vantage point where most of young Africans are participating in some of the biggest companies around the world, actually leading those companies in aerospace, in agriculture, in computer technology, in just different areas. All right, in automobile development, designs. You have Nigerians, for example, just occupying a lot of spaces like that, and a lot of Africans for that matter. There has been tremendous progress made by young Africans who are migrants in first world nations like the United States of America, Germany, you name the rest, in Europe, in America, and in Asia. Young Africans, they're doing well. The reality is this: if we can build a robust system on the continent of Africa that can integrate these people back, so that we can be able to take what they know and what they have been able to do to build these multi-million-dollar companies, to bring those technology back home and allow us to be able, to strive and build robust economic structures on the continent of Africa that will give us all that we need to compete with the rest of the world, especially within this 21st century. It might take us a decade or two, but I think that we have what it takes to do what we need to do. What is lacking is the will, is the fortitude, is this strength that we need to have that will say we will do what it takes for the greater good of the African. And the only major obstacle we have are these very corrupt people who are leading these nations. And until we get rid of them, it will be extremely difficult, to get somebody who is interested, about eating a cheeseburger, who just want to be able to put food or put wine in their mouth and sit at the table somewhere and talk about how good life is, when we have young men coming out of the African continent like Elon Musk, building starships and having just great engineering marvel, meanwhile the rest of those who are still on the continent of Africa has absolutely nothing to show for it. I think that we are quite demented when it comes to that. We have to be able to have this joy in self-reliance. Forget about the West for a minute, forget about the East for a minute, and ask yourself, what do we have on our hands? What is it in our possessions that we have? And use what we have to create the vision and to create the kind of continent, the kind of Africa that we want. That would be the most strategic thing we can do as Africans. And the reality is this: we have nobody to blame if we don't, only us. And that's why the best gift to any African and the best gift to any African leader is not a car, it's not a house, it's not a ring, it's not nothing, it's not diamonds, it's not gold. The best gift to any African and any African leader is a mirror.
A mirror to reflect, the reality on ground, and of course to be able to make changes that would turn the African continent around. Back to you, Shittu. Now, talking of turning the African continent around, what measures, what parameters could be put in place, for Africa to be able to stand steadfast amidst these numerous stones that have been thrown at the continent, looking in terms of international cooperation? And back on the ground, do you think that these travel bans, it's another call for Africa to be able to implement the procedure for the cross-border trade across the African continent, and to some extent, have a borderless Africa?
For Africa, I did say that this is like a wake-up call.
Yeah.
And there are lots of things we can do together as Africans. And it is because we are not trading enough, we are not touring the continent enough, we are not building bridges enough, we are living like we have a different future as individual countries. The more we interact, we transact, we go after the AFTA agreement, the better for us. Because there's a lot to be, unraveled on the continent. But because our focus is always to the west or to the east, most times we miss out on what is happening, on the continent. So it is for us to do more with ourselves, to explore areas of, communication, areas of knowledge sharing, areas of military collaboration, areas of business engagement, enterprise, tourism, and all that. When we have all of this, we would not be moved by such sanctions, because already most of the things that we demand from these countries are things that we do already for ourselves.
Thank you so much. Now proceeding with you, Dr. FONGOD, what remittances, looking at the African diaspora, what role can they play, and how could this impact, what impact could this have on the remittances that have been sent back home?
Well, it's a lot, and for example, I was quoting the issues of the country of Nigeria, stating that you're looking at close to about 25 billion US dollars, as of 2022, that came into the country as a result of remittance. That supersede whatever aid actually came in from America, which is about 1.5 billion into the country as foreign aid, which means that if you look at the amount of money sent just by remittance, which are Nigerians living outside of Nigeria, in the United States of America, and sending money into the continent, into the country, that is wonderful. The problem I have with that remittance is that, number one, it does two things. If you look at the rate of, basically some kind of inflation, where the prices of things are absolutely going up, and the reason for that is because you have all of these people who has all of this money, and then they want to people change, their way of living. They want to basically move up and live in better communities, and then prices of everything begins to rise as a result of that. That in itself is one of the issues. The problem I have is, if that money can be structured in such a way that it comes in, which is better so far as I'm concerned than any foreign direct investments into the continent, if we can be able to harness that, have structures on the ground where that money can come into some real investments, all right, into some structural development, into some folks basically maybe partnering up as Africans outside in the diaspora to be able to build up some factories, it will go a long way to create employment, and then it will basically have a blanket effect where everybody will rise at the same time. Reasons being, if you don't have anyone who is in the diaspora to be able to send you money, then you are really going to be in deep trouble, because you don't have that free money coming in like your neighbor who has a bunch of kids overseas. So for us to create some kind of a sustainable growth on the continent, and also help everybody else basically benefit from this, we have to create structures on the ground where we can be able to do this investment, and then build up hospitals, build schools, build factories, employ people from this money. It's a lot of money, and we can be able to do that, and basically help the government, especially as we try as much as we can to develop and grow small to medium-sized enterprises, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, a place where the capital market is non-existent, the bond market does not exist, and we do not have a lot of companies who are coming in, to learn the banking structure is absolutely shameful. And as a result of that, folks with ideas end up with ideas, and they do not have the capacity to be able to take that to the marketplace. If you can give them structures and give them money, and be able to let some of these people who are receiving this money actually participate as sponsors for some of these young people who are quite entrepreneurial in their mindset and have the skill sets to be able to build something, I think that will be meaningful.
Exactly, meaningful mostly for the African continent. Back to you, Shittu. Now, we're listening to your co-panelist. He stated, of course, that Africa has to stand up for itself. But then I mentioned one of my questions, that this is not the first time the United States is trying, especially the Donald Trump administration is trying to impose such measures on the African continent. This is the second time. Now, with that said, could you see this policy as a continuation of past U.S. immigration policies that were implemented on the African continent, or is it uniquely just aggressive towards African countries and the other nations that are considered on this blacklist?
Well, it is a continuation. It is not surprising, because during Trump's first tenure in office, he did put up a Muslim country ban and ban for African countries. In any case, it appeals to his followership base, those who are pro-Trump, who are happy about some of his policies. But it is not for us to be bothered that the United States is going about these policies. We should, as African countries, be able to say that when we miss out on one thing from the United States, we should be able to make up for it from other countries. The world of today is such that it doesn't, nobody's an island, as they say. So there has to be some sort of collaboration between African countries and other nations of the world. So first world countries can assist in some ways, can collaborate in some ways. We can share and even have better working conditions as members of the human race, as against we just looking at things as a for and against situation. So if America is protecting itself from unnecessary infiltration, what are we doing to protect ourselves? Is it fine that countries that are at war can cross over into other stable countries? Is it okay that Rwanda and Congo are loggerheads? Will it affect business, or will it affect transportation? Will it affect investment in the hospitality sector? So we must look at all of these things, these issues that are causing unnecessary bedlam and war and crisis on the continent. We must fix them with finality, so that Africans can explore more things. Africans can consider other areas of collective growth, because I believe that Africans are tied by the same band of the same destiny. Therefore, we have to look at things from a holistic perspective and in areas where we can help improve ourselves. Some of the countries that have been identified under the red, for example, are clearly countries that are almost a banana republic. I mean, what is the situation in South Sudan, the youngest African country that has refused to give a direction of growth, a direction of a sense of unity as a country. It has cost us so much in terms of human, material, and financial resources. Same with DR Congo, where the Congo has continued to bleed, leading to loss of lives and properties and wealth of nations. And it has led to unnecessary altercation between other African states and the country. So we have to nip these things in the bud before other countries begin to see us from a more evolved lens of view against what we have at the moment.
Thank you so much. But to stay with you, Shittu, do you believe that this could force some sort of anti-American sentiment across Africa, relating it to actually what happened with francs on the African continent?
The reason for which France was being sent out of the continent
was linked to colonial past.
There's a general sense of loss among African nations that have sent the French troops packing. There's a general sense of, I call it disproportionate business climate between France and other Sahelian states or other African francophone countries, for which they were basically thrown out of the country. If you see it as a tit for tat thing, then so be it. I mean, I know that primarily most Africans abroad or overseas impact those countries positively due to the nature of jobs they are doing. Some of them are doing two jobs at the same time. Some of them are doing high valued jobs, for which you are hardly able to get replacements. Some of them are in the medical line, and a lot is happening. I mean, if you look at the topmost medical doctors or medical officers in the United States and the UK, you will see that Nigerians constitute a huge chunk of that. It's a drain to Africa, but it's a gain to other countries of the world. So Africans can do better by really collaborating more and doing more with each other, as against waiting for some magic to happen between us and Western or Eastern nations.
Okay, thank you so much. Now, back to Dr. FONGOD. Now, you listen to your co-panelists. Now, looking at the African continent, we've always been charting for, you know, the Ubuntu perspective on the African continent, the Ubuntu ideology. And, of course, that's why we have programs like this. Now, in the wake of this latest development, that in one way or the other affects the African continent so much, how can Africans, you know, continue to nurture this ideology of Ubuntu? I am because you are on the African continent, so we don't get touched, you know, by latest decisions like this.
I think that the first thing first that we need to do so far as the continent is concerned is to make sure that we fully understand that the EU is the bad uncle that we have on the continent. You know how you have a family meeting and there's always this one uncle who basically is so demented, he always has to mess things up, and that person for the African is the EU. And except we are willing to be able to do that which is needful by making sure that we push power back into the blocks. We are talking about SADC, it's the East African Community, we are talking about ECOWAS, and then I would dare to say throw in also the alliance state over there with those boys in the Sahel. If we are able to do that, all right, then it will give us enough time to be able to revamp what we have so far as the EU is concerned. Reasons being, we're in trouble. We need help. And the problem with Africa is the fact that it's as if to say each time we talk about this issue, we wait for somebody like Donald Trump to come along and then say something or do something, and then it jolts up, and then we wake up from our sleep and says, what the hell is going on? We're going to fix this stuff, and then nothing happens. That is the pain of dealing with the African. We are completely not willing to do anything. We just want to sit there and allow and be reactionary to stuff. We need to be able to initiate things and then create stuff so that nobody catches us unaware. That's what we ought to do. If we're able to do that, then I'm quite hopeful that whatever comes basically will meet us at least building something, struggling to create something, to build an environment where young men and young women can thrive on the continent of Africa, to be an environment where people can travel outside of these European nations and Western nations to come and live in Africa, because we will become prosperous, quite peaceful, all right, having some of the most pristine wildlife, pristine, you know, untouched natural environment, which we still have a lot of it on the continent of Africa that has not been contaminated with waste and all kinds of you know, nuclear toxic waste. We have that privilege on the continent of Africa. If we can be able to build us and develop us, then the world will come to see exactly what we have built, and they will celebrate what we have built, and then the prosperity we are looking for will flourish across the continent of Africa. 60% of the world arable land is in Africa. We can feed the world, but yet we can't even feed ourselves, which means we are not doing enough, and we do not even have the capacity to do enough. Not because the resources are not there, but just because we have bad governance and nothing is happening. We need to be able to work with us, fix us, strengthen us, and if we are able to do so, then I can assure you that the future looks extremely bright, and that's what I'm hopeful for.
You see, the future looks bright for the African continent. I'll be coming back to you to, you know, to continue on that response. But then, Shittu, what role, in your perspective, can the young African, you know, play in a champion in this this change, which is needed, so much needed on the African continent?
Young people are already doing so much in terms of the tech space. You will have seen that there's a lot of impact that young Africans, smart, brilliant young Africans, are impacting on the tech space. And this is attracting a lot of funding from international agencies, because essentially we are creating a solution. This solution can solve the problem of 1 million or 10 million people involved, or even more. So the you know, there are many funders of some of these great concepts or great ideas that young Africans are you know, are going about. If you look at the tech, the education sector, you also look at areas of cultural appropriation. You know, you have the movies, you know, you have the songs, going viral, traveling all across the world. This already puts Africa on a positive spot on the global map. And young Africans will continue to do what they are doing because they know that it is easy for it to gain traction, to gain engagement, to get people talking, to get people involved. So on the side of the young Africans, we should commend young Africans. What we just expect is more and more of it. You cannot have enough of some of these concepts and some of these ideas. Some apps are developed such that when you look at what they are worth, they are probably worth 6 times or 7 times the annual budget of some African states. And a few individuals can put that together, who are sharp enough to see it as a solution and create that solution and earn money from it. And hopefully they'll be able to impact the African states positively from what they earn. That's it for me.
So that was Shittu who joined us all the way from Lagos in Nigeria in his capacity as a digital news editor. Back to Dr. FONGOD. Now, so we're going to be picking up from where you stopped. Now, in a bid to comprehend, the response of Shittu, the young African. From your perspective, from your point of view, what more is needed? From young Africans to be able to champion this change that is needed on the African continent. And of course, on the part of leaders, are there much more, is there much more that is expected from leaders on the African continent to be able to, swindle those changes that Africa needs so much at this particular point in time, especially when the continent of Africa is at loggerheads with some international powers?
Well, the reality is that for young Africans, I would like to say whatever we admire, we celebrate. And the young Africans will need to have role models that will be role models that will be able to steer this gigantic ship, which is the minds of young Africans, towards a more prosperous future where they are fully responsible so far as the continent is concerned. Not everybody else on the African continent can be a Davido. Not everybody else can be a Samuel Eto'o. Not everybody else can be a sports star. Not everyone can be a music star. Not everybody else can be into movies. Not everybody else can be into music. The reality is that there are a billion avenues around the world, and in any space that people can actually be able to thrive in. And we need to begin to celebrate those who are doing great things among us. I'm talking about those in engineering. I'm talking about good medical doctors, people who can inspire young people to get into medicine, people who can inspire young people to become writers, people who can inspire young people, to basically become engineers, folks who are building systems on the continent of Africa, who are getting into spaces where no one is there, so that they can be able to take over and build applications that will be able to cater, for the needs of the Africans. We need to begin to celebrate these people. Unfortunately, to those of us who are in the media, we have done a disservice to the continent by constantly pushing, music and sports as if to say that is all that there is. And absolutely, I have nothing against it. I don't care about it. I don't watch it. But I don't think that that's all that there is. There has to be a way in which we teach young Africans to fully believe in what's possible. There is an old saying by there's this group out in Asia. There's an old saying. I've forgotten the name of the group, but it's let me just state it. It states that if you give me a child, I think by the Gypsies for that matter, if you give me a child and when he is 7, I will show you a man. We have this speciality on the continent of Africa to basically indoctrinate our young people with nothing else but with the idea of scarcity and lack. We basically push them to believe that no matter how hard they try, things will just be difficult. I remember growing up as a kid, and all I heard was economic crisis, every day, economic crisis. My dad would leave the village and would have to travel to Yaoundé to go for something called arrears. True. There was tremendous pain and chaos. This was in the early 80s. But the reality is that, you know, for nothing did change so far as the country was concerned in terms of his political outlook. We still have the same president then, and we still have the same president now. But one thing is for sure, we have had multi-millionaires being created in that same ecosystem, all right? And so the reality is we can be able to adapt, we can be able to move, we can be able to do whatever it takes to succeed. I think this expression that if you want something as bad as you want to breed, nothing would stop you. And I think that that is the one thing that needs to flourish across the continent of Africa. We don't care the obstacle that stands before us. What matters is the fortitude and the will to be able to overcome those obstacles. And if you can breed desire and ambition and say to yourself, I will do whatever it takes to push this narrative forward, I will do whatever it takes to push this envelope forward, I will do whatever it takes to push this civilization forward, then you are in the right place right there on the continent of Africa, and you don't need to move an inch to be celebrated, you don't need to move an inch to be known, because frankly speaking, you have all that it takes to be the best version of yourself, not somebody else. Yourself. Why? Because you can only compete with you. You can have inspirations from other people, they can only compete with you because you know you understand who you were yesterday, and you can have measurable gains as to who you are today, and that is all that matters. And if that was going to be the case, enjoy the ride, feel a little bit good about who you are, and strive for a better tomorrow, being always the best version of yourself. Outdo you yesterday and be great today. That is the way we move forward, especially with our young people.
Especially with the young people. Now, given that we are culminating today's edition of the program, Dr. FONGOD, and now in a bit to wrap up today's conversation, we've stated a lot. You know, it's time for Africa to be able to take the bull by the horn and take the African continent forward. We mentioned equally that several, parameters, several blocks will have to be jumped for Africa to be able to take the continent to where it intends to be. But then from your perspective, now looking at it from a Pan-Africanist perspective, away from what the young people have to do, from what the leaders have to do on the continent, in your perspective, what is entirely needed for Africa to move forward?
Self-reliance. Let Africa depend on Africa. We have everything that it takes to succeed. And so if we can just depend on us, we will be successful. We don't need anything from anybody. And the reality is the world is coming for what we have. Let there be fair trade so we can sell what we have at fair market value and then use that to be able to develop us. And this means responsible leadership. And that's all that matters. Let us focus on us. I don't think there's anything outside of that. And frankly speaking, I do believe sincerely that if we enjoy this whole entire self-reliance life, we will build the next Saudi Arabia, the next Dubai, the next Istanbul, the next Manila. We will build the next Singapore right on the continent of Africa. We have what they don't have. All right, and we are so rich in ways that they cannot even imagine. Let's focus on us.
Indeed, it's time for Africa to focus. Just to add up to what you stated, these measures could go a long way in also bringing, a curbing a brain drain from the African continent. Africa needs to be self-reliant. Thank you immensely, Dr. Stanley FONGOD, a Pan-Africanist economist and CEO of FINTECH, for your input on today's edition of the program.
Thank you so much, Sharon, for having me, and thank my brother, my co-partners, for joining as well.
It was a pleasure to have you both, share your insight on course today's edition of the program. Meanwhile, ladies and gentlemen, today we were discussing the document that was revealed by the New York Times that stated that the Trump administration, or Trump, could be imposing some travel restrictions on 22 African countries. We had this conversation analyzing this latest development, but then we hope you learned a lot from the conversation, having in mind that Africa has what it takes if it's self-reliant to take the continent forward. Meanwhile, ladies and gentlemen, they'll have a great day in company of our programs.